Elena didn't know that the man standing in the shadows of the dungeon was the Alpha King himself. She didn't know that he'd been searching for his mate for over 3 decades, and she certainly didn't know that when his amber eyes fell on her huddled form in the corner cell, every instinct in his ancient soul had whispered the word he'd waited a lifetime to hear. Mine. All Elena knew was hunger. Cold stone pressed against her spine through the threadbare prison dress, and the metallic taste of fear coated her tongue as heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. 3 months she'd survived in this place, falsely accused of stealing her stepmother's emerald necklace. 3 months of stale bread and brackish water, of listening to other prisoners disappear in the night, taken for purposes she didn't dare imagine. "The choosing begins," announced Captain Morris, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Elena's breath caught in her chest as keys jangled against iron locks. The monthly ritual had arrived again, where prisoners vanished into darkness, selected by visiting lords for labour, sport, or worse. She pressed herself deeper into the corner, praying to become invisible among the shadows. The stranger's footsteps were different from the guards, measured, confident. Authority radiated from his presence even before Elena glimpsed his silhouette through the rusted bars. When he moved into the torchlight, her heart stuttered against her ribs. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore midnight black leather that spoke of wealth and power. His dark hair caught the flickering flames, and something dangerous lurked beneath the sharp angles of his face. But it was his eyes that stopped her world. Amber like molten gold, ancient and knowing, they swept past 24 other cells before finding hers. The moment their gazes locked, warmth spread through Elena's chest, impossible and terrifying. A golden thread seemed to shimmer between them, pulling taut with recognition she couldn't understand. "That one," the stranger said, his voice low and commanding. He pointed directly at Elena, and every guard in the corridor straightened as if struck by lightning. Elena's mouth went dry. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Please, I haven't done anything." The man stepped closer to her cell, and the warmth in her chest blazed hotter. Up close, she could see the precise cut of his jaw, the way his leather coat bore no embellishments yet screamed of wealth. When he spoke, it was gentle despite the power thrumming beneath each word. "You're not in trouble," he murmured, and something in his tone made her believe him. "I'm here to take you home." Home? Eleanor almost laughed at the bitter irony. She hadn't had a home since her father died 5 years ago, leaving her at the mercy of Victoria's cruelty. "I don't have a home." The stranger's expression softened, and impossibly she glimpsed something that looked like pain in those ancient eyes. "You do now." Captain Morris fumbled with his keys, hands trembling as he unlocked her cell. "Sir, are you certain? She's accused of theft and her bloodline—" "I'm certain." The stranger's voice carried absolute finality that made the captain step back immediately. When he looked at Elena again, his features gentled. "Will you come with me?" Every survival instinct screamed at her to refuse. Powerful men who chose prisoners from dungeons rarely had honourable intentions. She should say no, should cling to the familiar horror of her cell rather than risk whatever fresh nightmare awaited beyond these walls. But something about his amber gaze, something about the inexplicable warmth spreading through her bones made her nod. Elena rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware of her ragged appearance and unwashed hair. She must look like exactly what she was, nothing, a nobody accused of crimes and abandoned by family. Yet when the stranger offered his hand through the cell door, she found herself reaching for it. The moment their skin touched, lightning shot up her arm, and she gasped at the intensity of sensation. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated, in the sharp intake of breath he tried to hide. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles with devastating tenderness. "Eleanor," she whispered, hyper-aware of how small her hand looked engulfed in his much larger one. "Eleanor," he repeated, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I'm Marcus, and you never have to be afraid again." Elena stared up at him, this impossible man who'd appeared in her darkest hour like something from a fairy tale. She didn't know who he truly was, didn't understand the golden thread still humming between them, didn't comprehend why someone so clearly powerful would choose her from dozens of other prisoners. All she knew was that when Marcus led her from the cell, her legs followed without conscious thought. Behind them, Captain Morris stood frozen in obvious terror, and Elena caught the whispered words that made no sense. The Alpha King himself, gods preserve us all. But Elena didn't hear. She was too focused on the warmth of Marcus's hand in hers, on the impossible hope blooming in her chest, on the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was walking towards something better than the darkness she'd known. The castle that rose before Elena defied every expectation she'd harboured during their silent journey through moonlit forests. Moonstone towers spiralled towards star-drunk skies, their surfaces gleaming with an inner light that made her breath catch. Massive gates carved with intricate wolf motifs swung open at their approach, operated by guards who bowed so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the ground. Elena pressed closer to Marcus's side in the carriage, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of wealth surrounding them. Torches lined pathways paved with stones that sparkled like captured starlight, and fountains sang with crystal-clear water that would have been worth a fortune in the village where she'd grown up. Everything spoke of power beyond her comprehension. "This is too much," she whispered, acutely aware of her prison-stained dress and matted hair. "I don't belong here." Marcus's hand found hers in the darkness between them, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "You belong wherever I am." Before Elena could process the implications of that statement, the carriage stopped before marble steps that seemed to ascend to the heavens themselves. A woman in midnight blue velvet descended toward them, her silver hair pulled into an elegant knot and her bearing radiating quiet authority. "Your Majesty," the woman said, curtsying deeply to Marcus, and Elena's world tilted sideways. "Your Majesty." The words echoed in Elena's mind as servants appeared from seemingly everywhere, all bowing and murmuring deferential greetings to the man whose hand still held hers. Marcus acknowledged them with gracious nods, but his attention remained fixed on Elena's shocked face. "You're the king?" she breathed, the pieces finally clicking into place. The guard's terror, the instant obedience, the casual authority he wielded like breathing. "You're the Alpha King." Marcus studied her expression carefully, as if gauging her reaction to this revelation. "I am." Eleanor jerked her hand from his, stumbling backward until her spine hit the carriage wall. "Kings don't choose thieves from dungeons, kings don't—" She gestured helplessly between them. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Elena." Marcus stepped closer, his voice infinitely gentle. "You're not a thief, and you're not nothing." "But I am." The words tore from her throat, 3 months of despair and a lifetime of being told she was worthless finally spilling over. "I'm a bastard daughter who grew up as a servant in my own father's house. I have no family, no fortune, no bloodline worth acknowledging. What could the Alpha King possibly want with someone like me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the cool night air. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I've been searching for my mate for 37 years, he said quietly. "Do you know what that feels like? To rule a kingdom, to have everything I could ever want within reach, but to wake up every morning feeling like half my soul is missing?" Elena's breath caught. She'd heard stories of werewolf mates, of bonds that connected souls across impossible distances. But those were fairy tales told to children, not reality, not something that could happen to broken girls from broken homes. "I felt you the moment I walked into that dungeon," Marcus continued, taking another careful step closer. "Every instinct I possess recognized you instantly. The golden thread between us, that warmth in your chest when we touch. You feel it too." Eleanor's hand rose unconsciously to her heart, where that inexplicable warmth still pulsed in rhythm with his nearness. She wanted to deny it, wanted to claim it was imagination or desperation or anything other than the impossible truth he was suggesting. "You could have anyone," she whispered instead. "Queens and duchesses and women who know how to curtsy without falling over. Why would fate choose someone like me?" Marcus smiled then, soft and devastatingly tender. "Because fate is wiser than either of us understand." The silver-haired woman cleared her throat delicately, and Marcus turned toward her with obvious reluctance. "Eleanor, this is Mrs. Thorne, my head housekeeper. She's going to help you get settled while I attend to some urgent business." Mrs. Thorne stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately put Elena at ease. "It's an honour to meet you, my dear. Shall we get you into a hot bath and some proper clothes? You must be exhausted." Elena looked between them, still struggling to process the enormity of what Marcus had revealed. "I don't understand any of this." "You don't have to understand everything tonight," Marcus said gently. "Just trust that you're safe here. Trust that no one will hurt you while you're under my protection." Mrs. Thorne led Elena through corridors that belonged in dreams rather than reality, past tapestries that told stories of ancient wolf packs and frescoed ceilings that seemed to capture the very essence of moonlight. The chamber they entered took Eleanor's breath away. A bed large enough for 4 people draped in midnight blue silk, a fireplace tall enough for her to stand inside, and windows that overlooked gardens bathed in silver light. "This is too much," Elena repeated, touching the silk bed-sheets with reverent fingers. "This is yours," Mrs. Thorne corrected kindly, beginning to draw a bath in an adjoining chamber fitted with a porcelain tub large enough to swim in. "His Majesty was very specific about preparing the Queen's chambers." Elena spun toward her, eyes wide. "Queen's chambers? But I'm not. I can't be." Mrs. Thorne's smile was knowing and gentle. "The Alpha King doesn't bring just anyone to the castle, dear, and he certainly doesn't hold their hands like they're made of precious metals." Hours later, Elena sat before a fireplace wearing a silk nightgown that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, her hair clean and braided down her back. Mrs. Thorne had departed with promises of breakfast and a wardrobe consultation, leaving Eleanor alone with thoughts that refused to organise themselves into anything resembling sense. A soft knock interrupted her spiralling confusion. Marcus stood in the doorway, no longer wearing his intimidating leather, but simple dark pants and a white shirt that made him look younger, more approachable. He'd obviously bathed as well. His dark hair was damp and curling slightly at the ends. "May I come in?" Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Marcus settled into the chair across from hers, maintaining careful distance while somehow managing to fill the entire room with his presence. "I know this is overwhelming," he said quietly. "I know you have questions." "I don't understand why fate would choose this," Elena whispered, staring into the flames rather than meeting his eyes. "I can't trust this. People like me don't get fairy tales." Marcus was quiet for several heartbeats before responding. "What happened to you, Elena? Who convinced you that you're not worthy of happiness?" The gentle question broke something loose in her chest, and before she could stop herself, the words were pouring out. She told him about her father's death, about Victoria's cruelty, about years of being told she was a burden and a mistake. She told him about the false accusation that had landed her in prison, about 3 months of believing she would die forgotten and alone. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with every revelation. When she finally finished, tears tracking silently down her cheeks, he spoke with quiet fury. "They were wrong about everything. You are not a mistake. You are not worthless. You are the missing piece of my soul, Elena, and I would burn down kingdoms to keep you safe." Elena met his eyes then, seeing truth blazing in their amber depths. "I can't trust this," she repeated, but her voice was weaker now, hope battling against years of protective cynicism. Marcus nodded as if he'd expected exactly that response. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. However long you need to believe that you deserve love, however long it takes for you to trust that I won't leave, I'll wait. I've waited 37 years to find you. I can wait however long you need to find your way to me. Eleanor stared at him, this impossible man who claimed to be her destined mate, who looked at her like she was precious instead of broken. The golden thread between them hummed with warmth and possibility, and for the first time in her life she allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she stopped running from hope. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Marcus's smile was soft and patient. "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." 2 weeks passed in a dream Eleanor was terrified of waking from. Marcus kept his word about patience, never pushing for more than she could give, while surrounding her with a tenderness she'd never known existed. They shared meals where he listened to her thoughts on books from his vast library, walked through moonlit gardens where he told her stories of his childhood, and sat before fireplaces where comfortable silence stretched between them like golden thread made tangible. Elena was beginning to believe she might actually deserve this happiness when the nightmare from her past arrived in the form of a royal summons. "Court is in session today," Marcus explained over breakfast, his expression carefully neutral. "Various nobles present petitions and disputes for royal judgment. You're welcome to observe from the gallery if you'd like." Eleanor nodded, curious about this aspect of his duties. She'd grown comfortable in the castle's private spaces, but the thought of seeing Marcus in his role as king intrigued her. Mrs. Thorne helped her dress in a gown of deep emerald silk that made her feel almost worthy of standing beside royalty. And Elena made her way to the great hall with anticipation humming in her chest. The massive chamber filled quickly with nobles in their finest attire, their conversations creating a low buzz that reminded Elena uncomfortably of insects. She took her place in the gallery, overlooking the throne, where Marcus sat in midnight black robes, every inch the powerful ruler she sometimes forgot he was in their private moments. Elena was admiring the way authority seemed to radiate from him, when familiar voices cut through the courtly chatter like poisoned blades. "Your Majesty, we seek justice for crimes committed against our family." Elena's blood turned to ice. Victoria stood in the centre of the hall, wearing burgundy velvet and her cruelest smile, while Clarissa posed beside her in powder blue that made her look deceptively innocent. Both women curtsied with perfect form, their performance of noble grace masking the venom Eleanor knew lurked beneath. Panic clawed up Eleanor's throat. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the gallery, praying they wouldn't spot her among the crowd of spectators. Her hands trembled against the stone railing as memories flooded back, years of cruel words, impossible tasks, and the constant reminder that she was nothing more than a burden they suffered out of Christian duty. "State your grievance," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Victoria stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own righteousness. "My lord, we seek the return of a family heirloom stolen by my late husband's bastard daughter. She fled after the theft and has been evading justice for months." Eleanor's vision blurred at the edges. This was it. The moment Marcus would realise what she truly was, not mysterious and worthy of his attention, but exactly what Victoria had always said. A bastard, a thief, a mistake that should never have been born. "Describe this alleged thief," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Elena's heart stutter with hope and terror in equal measure. Clarissa spoke up then, her voice carrying just the right note of wounded innocence. "Elena Blackwood, Your Majesty, my father's illegitimate daughter, who we charitably raised after his death. We gave her shelter, food, a place in our household, and she repaid our kindness by stealing my mother's emerald necklace." The great hall fell silent. Elena watched in horrified fascination as every head turned toward the gallery, searching for signs of the accused. She shrank deeper into her corner, but it was useless. Victoria's sharp eyes found her within moments. "There!" Victoria pointed directly at Elena, triumph blazing across her features. The thief hides in your very court, your majesty. She has clearly seduced someone here with lies about her innocence." Elena felt the weight of hundreds of stares like physical blows. The nobles whispered among themselves, their voices creating a buzz of speculation and judgment that made her want to disappear entirely. She was acutely aware of the emerald silk gown that had made her feel beautiful moments before. Now it felt like a costume, proof that she was pretending to be something she could never be. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos with devastating calm. "Elena Blackwood is under my personal protection." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, but Victoria's smile only widened. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean to shelter a common thief? Her bloodline alone should disqualify her from—" "You will not speak of my mate with such disrespect." The words fell like thunderclaps in the sudden silence. Elena's breath stopped entirely as every person in the hall turned to stare at Marcus with expressions ranging from shock to awe to calculation. The Alpha King had just publicly claimed a bastard accused of theft as his destined mate. Victoria's face went white with fury and disbelief. "Your mate? Your Majesty, surely you've been deceived. Eleanor is nothing more than—" "She is more honourable than both of you combined," Marcus interrupted, rising from his throne with lethal grace. "Eleanor Blackwood has never stolen anything in her life. The emerald necklace you claim she took was sold by your own hand to cover gambling debts, and you used her as a convenient scapegoat." Eleanor stared down at him in amazement. He'd known, somehow impossibly, he'd known the truth all along and had still chosen her anyway. Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Lady Victoria, you and your daughter will surrender any claim to the Blackwood estate immediately. You will also provide full restitution to the merchants you've cheated over the past year, using Elena's supposed crimes to avoid payment." Victoria sputtered in outrage, but Clarissa grabbed her mother's arm with white-knuckled fingers. Both women seemed to finally understand that they'd made a terrible miscalculation in bringing their accusations before the Alpha King himself. "Furthermore," Marcus added, his amber eyes finding Elena's across the distance separating them, "you will never speak my mate's name again, nor will you set foot on any land under my protection. Guards, escort them from my sight." Elena watched in stunned disbelief as the two women who'd tormented her for years were marched from the hall in disgrace, their carefully constructed lies crumbling around them like ash. The nobles who remained whispered furiously among themselves, clearly struggling to process what they'd witnessed. But Eleanor only had eyes for Marcus, who was climbing the stairs toward the gallery with purposeful strides. When he reached her hiding place in the shadows, his expression was fierce and tender in equal measure. "Did you think I didn't know?" he asked softly, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. "Did you think I would claim you as mine without understanding exactly who you are?" Elena's eyes filled with tears she couldn't contain. "You knew about my birth, about the accusations?" "I knew everything before I walked into that dungeon," Marcus murmured, his thumbs brushing away the tears tracking down her cheeks. "I knew you were innocent. I knew you'd been blamed for their crimes. I knew you'd suffered because of their greed and cruelty." Elena stared up at him, this impossible man who'd defended her before his entire court, who'd known her darkest shame and chosen her anyway. For the first time in her life, she considered the revolutionary possibility that she might actually deserve love. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice shaking with hope and terror and desperate longing. "I want to trust this, to trust you." Marcus's smile was radiant as moonrise. "Then we begin from here." Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her chest, like armour she'd worn for so long, she'd forgotten its weight finally falling away. She was still afraid, still scarred by years of cruelty and rejection, but for the first time in her life she was willing to stand still and let happiness find her. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus leaned down to press his forehead against hers, his amber eyes warm with promise. "Now, my love, The real story begins. Marcus announced their formal mating ceremony 3 days later, his declaration sending shockwaves through the kingdom that Eleanor felt reverberating in her very bones. She stood frozen in the castle's main corridor as servants bustled around them with barely contained excitement, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of anticipation that made her head spin. "Everyone will think you made a mistake," Elena protested, her hands twisting in the silk of her morning gown. "They'll think I don't belong here, that I somehow tricked you into—" Marcus silenced her fears with gentle fingers pressed to her lips, his amber eyes blazing with absolute certainty. "You belong with me. You belong here. And in 3 days the entire kingdom will witness exactly how precious you are to me." The preparations became a whirlwind of activity that swept Elena along like a leaf caught in autumn wind. Mrs. Thorne appeared with a team of seamstresses who measured and fitted Elena for a gown that belonged in fairy tales rather than reality. Ivory silk shot through with threads of gold, it clung to her curves before flowing into a train that seemed to capture moonlight in its folds. "It's too much," Elena whispered, staring at her reflection in the floor-length mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, elegant, regal, worthy of standing beside a king. "It's exactly right," Mrs. Thorne replied firmly, adjusting the delicate golden circlet that would serve as Elena's crown. "You look like a queen, dear, because that's precisely what you are." Elena tried to protest, but the words died in her throat when Marcus appeared in the doorway of the fitting chamber. His expression when he saw her took her breath away. Wonder and possession and fierce tenderness all blazing together in those ancient amber eyes. "Beautiful," he murmured, crossing to her with movements that reminded her of a predator approaching something infinitely precious. Absolutely devastating. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the castle windows like divine blessing. Elena woke with her stomach churning between excitement and terror, the reality of what was about to happen finally settling into her bones. She was about to become queen, queen to the Alpha King, mate to the most powerful man in the kingdom, permanent partner to someone who looked at her like she hung the stars themselves. "I can't do this," she whispered to her reflection as Mrs. Thorne and her assistants helped her into the magnificent gown. "What if I stumble? What if I say something wrong? What if everyone realizes I'm not supposed to be here?" Mrs. Thorne appeared behind her in the mirror, her expression gentle but firm. "Child, do you know what I see when I look at you?" Elena shook her head mutely. "I see a woman who survived 3 months in a dungeon and came out with her kindness intact. I see someone who reads to the kitchen children when she thinks no one is watching, who remembers every servant's name, who makes the Alpha King smile like he's never done in all his years. That woman belongs exactly where she's going." The great hall had been transformed into something from dreams. Thousands of white roses cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, their petals creating a carpet of ivory and cream that led to the altar where Marcus waited. Candles burned in crystalline holders that cast rainbow light across the assembled crowd, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with magic. Elena's breath caught when she saw him standing at the altar. Marcus wore ceremonial robes of midnight black embroidered with silver wolves, and a crown that spoke of ancient power rested on his dark hair. But it was his expression when their eyes met across the distance that made her knees weak. Absolute adoration and fierce possession combined. The walk down that petal-strewn aisle felt both eternal and instantaneous. Eleanor was dimly aware of hundreds of faces turned toward her, of whispered conversations and gasps of appreciation, but her entire world had narrowed to Marcus's amber gaze pulling her forward like a golden thread. When she reached the altar, Marcus took her hands in his much larger ones, and the familiar warmth blazed between them like captured starfire. The ancient priest began speaking words of binding and unity, but Elena barely heard them over the thundering of her own heart. Do you, Elena Blackwood, accept Marcus Thorne as your mate, your king, your eternal partner through all the days of this life and whatever lies beyond?" Elena looked up into Marcus's eyes and saw her entire future written there, love and partnership and belonging beyond her wildest dreams. "I do." "And do you, Marcus Thorne, Alpha King of the Northern Realm, accept Eleanor Blackwood as your mate, your queen, your eternal partner through all the days of this life and whatever lies beyond?" Marcus's voice rang clear and strong through the cathedral silence. "I do. Before all the gods and all our people, I claim Elena as mine forever." The priest smiled and gestured for them to complete the ancient ritual. Marcus's hands framed Elena's face with devastating tenderness before he lowered his head to the curve of her neck. When his teeth pierced the sensitive skin just below her ear, marking her permanently as his mate, white-hot pleasure shot through Elena's entire body, and she gasped at the intensity. The hall erupted in cheering that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. Marcus pulled back to look at her, his thumb brushing over the small wound that would mark her as queen for the rest of her life, and his smile was radiant as sunrise. "My queen," he murmured, and then his lips were on hers in a kiss that tasted like promise and possession, and forever. Eleanor melted into him, distantly aware of the crowd's approval washing over them like waves. When they finally broke apart, she caught sight of familiar faces in the assembled nobles, Victoria and Clarissa standing at the very back of the hall, their expressions twisted with fury and disbelief as they watched the bastard daughter they tormented become everything they'd said was impossible. Marcus followed her gaze, and his expression hardened with protective fury. His voice carried clearly through the hall as he made his final declaration. "Anyone who disrespects the Queen disrespects me. Anyone who harms her answers to me. She is mine, and I protect what is mine." Elena stared up at him, this impossible man who'd claimed her before his entire kingdom, who'd made her his equal in the eyes of gods and mortals alike. The golden thread between them blazed with warmth and rightness, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt completely and utterly safe. "I'm home," she whispered, the words barely audible above the continued cheering. "I'm finally home." Marcus's smile was soft and fierce and infinitely tender. "You were always meant to be here, my love. You were always meant to be mine." As he led her from the altar, with her hand clasped securely in his, Eleanor felt the last of her fears dissolve like morning mist. She was no longer the broken girl who'd hidden in dungeon shadows. She was Elena Thorne, queen to the Alpha King, beloved mate to the most powerful man in the realm. She was exactly where she belonged. 3 months after her coronation, Elena woke each morning with sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked gardens she now considered home. The girl who had once cowered in dungeon shadows felt like a distant memory, as Queen Eleanor Thorne moved through her days with growing confidence and purpose. "The prison reform proposal is ready for your review," Marcus said over breakfast, sliding a leather portfolio across their private dining table. His amber eyes sparkled with pride as he watched her flip through pages covered in her own careful handwriting. "The council was impressed with your detailed recommendations." Elena smiled, warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the supernatural bond and everything to do with Marcus's unwavering support of her initiatives. "I want to visit the dungeons again before we implement the changes. I need to see if there are other details I missed." Marcus reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "This is why fate chose you," he murmured, his thumb tracing circles across her knuckles. "Your compassion, your refusal to let suffering continue when you have the power to stop it. You're exactly the queen this kingdom needs." The journey to the lower levels of the castle was one Elena made regularly now, though each visit still sent echoes of memory through her bones. She wore simple blue wool instead of silk, practical boots instead of delicate slippers, because she'd learned that prisoners responded better to someone who looked approachable rather than intimidating. "Cell number 7, she told the guard captain, Marcus's steady presence at her back as they descended stone steps that no longer held terror for her. "The woman accused of stealing bread for her children. Has the magistrate reviewed her case?" "Released yesterday, Your Majesty," Captain Morris replied, his tone respectful in a way that still amazed Elena. "Her husband's debts were forgiven, and she's been given work in the castle kitchens." Elena nodded, satisfaction warm in her chest. Each small victory felt monumental. Lives saved, families reunited, justice actually served instead of simply performed. They paused outside her old cell, and Eleanor stared through the iron bars at the stone corner where she'd spent 3 months believing she would die forgotten and unloved. The straw was fresher now, the walls cleaner, but the space still echoed with despair. "I was so afraid to hope," she whispered, her fingers curling around the cold metal. "I'd convinced myself that people like me didn't deserve rescue." Marcus stepped closer, his warmth solid and comforting at her back. "And now you're rescuing others who believe the same lie." Eleanor turned to face him, struck again by how perfectly he seemed to understand her heart. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that I'm actually here, actually helping people instead of just surviving." "Believe it," Marcus said, his hands framing her face with the same devastating tenderness he'd shown from their very first meeting. "You've saved more lives in 3 months than most rulers manage in years." Their return to the royal chambers was interrupted by Mrs. Thorne, whose expression carried the particular combination of excitement and nervousness that Elena had learned meant significant news. "Your Majesty," the older woman said, curtsying deeply, "Dr. Whitmore has finished his examination and requests an audience." Elena's heart stuttered as the royal physician entered with a leather medical bag and a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She'd been feeling unusually tired lately, strange waves of nausea that came and went without explanation, and Marcus had insisted on a thorough examination despite her protests. "Congratulations, Your Majesties," Dr. Whitmore said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "You're with child, about 6 weeks along, I'd estimate." Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Pregnant. She was carrying Marcus's child. Their child, a future prince or princess who would grow up knowing love and security instead of fear and rejection. Marcus was at her side instantly, kneeling beside her chair with wonder blazing in his amber eyes. "Elena, how do you feel about this?" She stared down at him. This impossible man who'd given her everything she'd never dared dream of wanting. "Terrified," she whispered honestly, "and amazed, and so incredibly happy I can barely breathe." Marcus's smile was radiant as he pressed his forehead against hers. "Our children will never know hunger," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "They'll never doubt their worth, never question whether they're loved. They'll grow up knowing they're precious from the moment they draw breath." Elena's eyes filled with tears at the fierce protectiveness already blazing in his voice. "They'll be so lucky to have you as their father." "They'll be lucky to have you as their mother," Marcus corrected, his hands covering her still flat stomach with reverent care. "You're going to teach them kindness and compassion and how to use power to help rather than harm." That evening, Elena stood on the balcony overlooking gardens where she'd once walked as a terrified guest, now surveying the kingdom she helped rule with growing confidence. The sunset painted everything in shades of gold and rose, and the air carried the scent of jasmine and possibility. Marcus joined her, sliding his arms around her waist from behind and pulling her back against his chest. His hands settled protectively over their unborn child, and Elena covered them with her own. "I keep thinking about that girl in the dungeon," she said softly. "How broken she was, how convinced she was worthless. If someone had told her she'd be standing here 6 months later, carrying the future heir to the kingdom—" "She wouldn't have believed it," Marcus finished, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck where his mating bite had left its permanent mark. But that girl was stronger than she knew, braver than she understood, more worthy of love than anyone had ever told her. Elena leaned back against him, marvelling at how completely her life had transformed. The desperate survivor who'd expected execution had become a queen beloved by her subjects, a woman who used her past pain to heal others' wounds, a future mother who would break the cycles of cruelty that had defined her childhood. "I know you'll never leave me," she whispered, the words carrying weight of absolute trust that would have been impossible 6 months ago. "I know our children will grow up safe. I know I finally found where I belong." Marcus tightened his arms around her, solid and warm and infinitely precious. "You didn't just find where you belong, my love. You found who you were always meant to be." Eleanor closed her eyes and let that truth settle into her bones. She'd thought she was worthless, but she'd simply been waiting for the right person to see her value. She'd believed she was broken, but she just needed someone patient enough to help her heal. Now she was whole. Now she was home. Now she was exactly where fate had always intended her to be, in the arms of her mate, carrying their future, surrounded by love that would never fail. "I love you," she said, the words no longer frightening but simply true. "And I love you," Marcus replied against her hair, "today, tomorrow, and for all the days fate gives us." Above them, stars began appearing in the deepening sky, each point of light a promise of the bright future stretching ahead of them. Eleanor smiled and settled deeper into Marcus's embrace, finally understanding what it meant to be truly, completely, perfectly home. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the same dungeon corridor where her story had truly begun, but now she wore a crown of starlight and a gown of midnight blue silk that whispered of power and grace. The anniversary of their first meeting had become a sacred tradition, a pilgrimage to remember how far they'd travelled from that moment of impossible hope. "You saved me from more than just prison," Elena said softly, her fingers intertwined with Marcus's as they paused outside her former cell. "You saved me from a life of believing I was nothing." Marcus brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss to her wedding ring. "You saved me too," he murmured against her skin, "from a life without purpose, without the other half of my soul." Their twin children slept peacefully in the royal nursery above, Prince Alexander, with his father's amber eyes, and Princess Isabella with her mother's stubborn chin. Elena could hardly believe these perfect beings had grown beneath her heart, could barely comprehend that she, who had once been unwanted, was now mother to the future of the kingdom. The walk back through castle corridors felt like travelling through a dream made manifest. Portraits of Elena now hung beside Marcus's ancestors, her image captured in oils that spoke of dignity and strength. Servants bowed with genuine respect rather than fearful obligation, and Elena knew she had earned their loyalty through fairness and compassion rather than inherited it through bloodline. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Thorne approached with her characteristic efficiency, though her eyes sparkled with affection that went far beyond professional duty. "Lady Victoria has arrived for her scheduled audience." Elena's stomach tightened reflexively at the name, though the terror that once accompanied thoughts of her stepmother had long since transformed into something closer to pity. Victoria had lost everything in the year since Elena's coronation. Her stolen wealth redistributed to its rightful owners, her social standing reduced to barely tolerated pariah status. Her daughter Clarissa married off to a minor lord who kept them both on a very tight leash. "Send her in," Elena said, squaring her shoulders with the confidence she'd learned to wear as naturally as breathing. Victoria entered the throne room looking older than Elena remembered, her once pristine appearance now showing signs of genuine hardship. The burgundy velvet had been replaced by simple brown wool, and her face carried lines of worry that no amount of cosmetics could disguise. "Your Majesty," Victoria said, curtsying with perfect form despite the obvious effort it cost her pride, "I come to request an audience regarding the Blackwood estate." Elena studied the woman who had tormented her for years, feeling nothing but calm detachment where rage once lived. The estate your gambling debts forced you to mortgage? The lands you lost through your own poor decisions? Victoria's jaw tightened, but she maintained her respectful posture. I hoped perhaps, given our family connection, you might consider— We have no family connection, Elena interrupted gently but firmly. You made that clear when you accused me of theft to cover your crimes, when you allowed me to rot in prison for months, when you told the entire court I was worthless. For a moment Victoria's mask slipped, and Eleanor glimpsed the fury still burning beneath the desperate civility. You cannot mean to leave us with nothing. Clarissa is your sister. Clarissa is nothing to me, Elena said, her voice carrying the absolute authority she'd learned to wield. Just as you made sure I was nothing to you. However, I am not cruel as you were cruel. Elena gestured to the steward waiting at the side of the hall. You will receive a small cottage on the outskirts of the kingdom, and a modest allowance sufficient for basic needs. This is more kindness than you showed me, but I will not have it said that Queen Eleanor Thorne left family to starve. Victoria's face cycled through emotions, relief, gratitude, and bitter resentment warring for dominance. Finally, she managed a stiff nod. Thank you, Your Majesty. I forgive you, Elena added quietly, and meant it. But I will not forget. Use this second chance wisely, Victoria. You will not receive another. After the guards escorted Victoria from the hall, Marcus approached the throne with pride blazing in his amber eyes. Gracious but firm, he murmured, his hand coming to rest on Elena's shoulder. Exactly the queen this kingdom needs. That evening they walked through gardens where Eleanor had once been too afraid to believe she belonged. Now roses bloomed under her direction, pathways led where she willed them to go, and every flowering bush testified to the life she'd built from the ashes of her former existence. Their children played among the flower beds, Alexander chasing butterflies with fierce determination, while Isabella examined petals with scientific curiosity. Elena's heart swelled watching them, confident, loved, secure in ways she'd never been allowed to be. Every day I choose you again, Marcus said suddenly, stopping beside a fountain where moonlight danced on crystal water. Elena turned to face him, struck as always by the miracle of his love. And every day I choose to stay, she replied, the words carrying the weight of vows renewed and trust deepened. Marcus pulled her into his arms, and their kiss tasted of promise and permanence and all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them. When they broke apart, Eleanor could hear the distant sounds of celebration from the village below, her subjects gathering for the evening festivals she'd instituted, bringing music and joy to lives that had once known only work and worry. They love you, Marcus observed, following her gaze toward the lights twinkling in the distance. They love us, Elena corrected, leaning into his warmth. They love what we've built together. Later that night, as Elena tucked their children into beds carved from moon-pale wood and hung with curtains that sparkled like captured starlight, Alexander caught her hand with tiny fingers that already showed signs of his father's strength. "Mamma," he whispered in the way of children who sensed important moments, "tell us the story." Elena smiled and settled between their beds, Isabella's dark head already resting against her shoulder. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice soft with wonder that never faded, "there was a girl who thought she was nothing." "But she was wrong," Isabella added sleepily, having heard this tale countless times. "Very wrong," Elena agreed, "because she wasn't nothing at all. She was just waiting to be found by someone who could see her worth." As her children drifted towards sleep, Elena reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her here. The terrified prisoner who'd expected execution had become a beloved queen. The girl, convinced of her own worthlessness, had learned to value herself as highly as others valued her. The broken survivor had discovered that healing was possible when love proved stronger than pain. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression tender as he watched their small family. Happy ending? He asked quietly. Eleanor rose and moved into his embrace, feeling the absolute rightness of belonging that still amazed her after all this time. Perfect beginning, she corrected, thinking of all the years stretching ahead of them, all the love yet to be shared, all the children yet to be raised in safety and certainty of their worth. I was never nothing, she whispered against his chest, finally understanding the truth that had taken her so long to accept. I was just waiting to be found. Marcus tightened his arms around her, solid and warm and infinitely precious. And I was waiting to find you. Above them, stars wheeled through midnight skies, bearing witness to love that had conquered fear and hope that had triumphed over despair. Elena Thorne, Queen of the Northern Realm, beloved mate to the Alpha King, devoted mother to future princes and princesses, finally understood what it meant to be home.